그래, 나 가서 괜히 하죠. 저기 미 류딘데 될이야 하는 저기 바 직다가 있나 안될이야 균유 초대 연den유 초 2, 3다다 요레스 균유 초 3다 셰바이나 안지 유 안레다 뇽바바들 껴와 안 류딘 될이야 내나서 뭐 강가 뭐 예드견사 안될이야 미장화 저 균 탐제다 균 먹고단 제되가 미장화래 사지 이 균유 전에다 단 지시 연된 초는 따바 3다바네 만주기 미류 둔조다 미다 제반의 미류된 델이야 남주기 만주 레바다 자조상의 돈에 남주시 우 개발도 보 배주 땅돈 땅투고레스 된 델에 때네 안 만주기 강세야다 디기주에 배지 현다 미라비기 아니 지금 도시는 납신 줍투고레스 다지 만주기 류된 델이야 연된 초다다 인경이 초다다 연된 초 3다다 디니세 다네 드네 줍투고이나 상이아즈 류딘들의 교연다 연된 데니 슈베나 상이기 어느 꾸디 가르래랍나 상이 꾸디 교연 탐제다 자와래서 교연 윤의 메딩아래서지 어두시로하다 다네 교연 탐제면나 딩안주 톱투고래 투고 말했으니 안주 톱투고래서 상이 꾸디 수익 관계 안에 지게 소수기 수관계 따고 잡샤가요 말했어 지상 소수기 냠는 제바 있나 상이 꾸디 톱투고래서 간에 지역으로서는 아니 산지고 토외기 탑람 되게 람림바 냠내지다 림바디 하고 같이 되는 소수기 셈 곰잡네 두체베나 만산이고 톱투그리에서 이제 안도스는 가서 가서 괜히 디고마 주사바체
Good morning. A couple of days ago, we looked at two verses, one from engaging in the Bodhisattva's way of life and a second from a particular sutra. And to summarize these two verses that we looked at then, is that this human life that we've achieved and this body that we take such care of, we can look at it from two perspectives. On one perspective is a perspective of faults and difficulties, and another perspective is on the class of benefit. So from the perspective of faults and difficulties, we know that we experience physical suffering, mental anguish, and this body is a basis for experiencing that. And on the other side, though, this body has a beneficial side to it, in that it is the basis, or this life rather, is a basis that through using in particular our unique human intelligence, that we can develop our minds and we can develop a variety of skills and talents that we can use in a way to benefit others as well as ourselves. And when we engage in activities that bring benefit to those beyond ourselves, not only to our close circle, our loved ones, but to strangers too. So in this way, we can look at this life we've achieved from the perspective of problems and difficulties that this life we do experience in this life, but also the tremendous potential. And this potential, though, can be developed. And those beings who have attained the body of a Buddha, those beings who have transformed this priceless jewel of this life into that of a Buddha, they have an existence that is completely perfected. All good qualities are developed to the point of perfection, and all faults have been eradicated, not leaving even the slightest of traces. And such a body or an existence as a Buddha is something that is not owned by someone, it's not possessed by them, and therefore being theirs to bestow on those whom they choose worthy. Rather, all beings, in particular humans, have this capacity that we can transform our minds into that of a Buddha, develop ourselves into the attainment of the state of a Buddha. And the way this is done is based on our thorough knowledge of the Dharma, all faults are purified, and qualities developed.
다 산지 고방 토베게 탑람디기 하고 와체 냠len 제반나 산지 고방 톱투고 어레스 데네자 당한주일야 데네기 다데 바도 다 미다 된조다 데네기 가서 지게 산지 고방 토마토 하바데 가르쳐 버려야지다 가르치 다 가르치네 교인 가르치는 아주 직사적 거만 통마도 하고 그래서지 교인 가르친 라바를 해서지 어두시는 아주 야다 지금 대화를 삼로를 얘기로 봐.
Recognizing that the state of Buddhahood, a state of perfected good qualities, freed of all pain and misery, is possible, naturally one will want to know, how so? How do I achieve it? And also, not only what do I develop within myself so that I can attain enlightenment, but what obstacles will I encounter? So both sides, the obstacles that need to be eliminated, as well as the good qualities that need to be developed, we'll want to know what both of these are so that we can fulfill our potential.
안징아 지ten 지sol이야 안 가르치고서네 삼는 레갈레다 아니 지 디기주야다 동화세기 탑람 가르 비슷한 거래 안지 가라 하 먹어 왔지 너트 휴고래 세지 디걸 마셔야래.
So today then, in our talk this morning, we'll look at how us as human beings and society, how we can go about living our life, transforming ourselves in order to overcome difficulties and attain happiness.
세상 아주 미나라 둔로이나다 차상 디기 대화도 되고 동화도 되고 말해서 이내 디 돈달이야 안 내가 간세 가서 직 배수를 라랜로 지마 손을 내가로 가서 지고 알아야다. 안도시네 쉬어도다 되네게 인자 안 될이야 안 가리 너트 가리 쇼버리 안디 삼로 가서 땅고 너트 디파 매바 쇠지 너트 세게 탑람 삼로 가서 땅고 그래야지 안데 디링이 돼 두시에 내서 디차거래.
Everyone here, and in fact all human beings, as well as all non-humans, such as animals, really we are on a slightly deeper level, all the same. Beyond our superficial differences, we are all the same in desiring happiness, an existence freed of pain and suffering. And that wish for happiness that is freed from pain and suffering is the motivation behind every activity that every being engages in. Everything, every thought, verbal communication or utterance, as well as physical activity that every being engages in, is motivated by this wish. I want to be freed of difficulties and experience happiness. So now we'll talk about what is the skillful method to engage in to actually achieve that.
안제스 시월에 준비 준주를 가르송여서네 동안을 더더세 미야장 동안이라 엄버juk 대와 되장 티무베 랑게 대와 자더 좀스 어두 송여래.
Looking at the verses before you, I think this will be the final one, the fourth one you have. It's from the first chapter of engaging in Shantideva's engaging in the Bodhisattva's way of life. Though beings long to be rid of suffering, they run directly towards suffering itself. Though longing for happiness, in their confused ignorance, they destroy their own happiness as if it were an enemy.
자다 델리아 당보딜라 동을 더드세 미야장하시오. 동안이라 몸버죽세. 자다 나랑 저기 미다 네 미마인비게 된로 간데시나 차상 소소 강아디야 직파 매바서야 돼 강아디 탈야게 동아 더다서 더와서는 매바서야 탈와 동아 더야게 매바서야게 삼로도 요레스 이내야 안에 내가 레탕 동아 더야게 동아디 매바서야게 된다려야 탑람 비지 따도 아니 디기 탑람 딘 동아 매바서야게 탑람 따다 하 먹어야지 탑람도 노르지 비지 따지네 아니 가서려 동아 더야게 잡려야 동아디 내용 거 해지래.
Bearing in mind what I said in a previous segment, that our motivation, the motivation of all of us, is to experience happiness and be freed of suffering, we know from lived experience this is not what we encounter. And this is borne out in the first two lines. Though beings long to be rid of suffering, they run directly towards suffering itself. Despite never wanting to experience any physical or mental pain or anguish, at all. We know we keep encountering it. And this is because we don't know the unmistaken method to get rid of or to abandon suffering. Rather, the techniques we apply are flawed. Hence, we keep encountering unwanted situations again and again.
Gyudil pa beshitan gores, gyudi chigore chirwa, da nga zi gyuk sede, gyudile beshitan gores. Chisa dunga yoya nga zi dunga sede diken gyudan kien chile tine yungur mado, gyudan kien kaya meba dunga yoya yo mare. Dewa sedan gyudan kien chile tine dewa yungur mado, gyudan kien meba dewa yoya mare. Pena nga zi tuandoa karita bina, pena shingdoa karigoyena, shingdoa di korang kiegi gyu sabon di tab, dela tine shingdoa ki shingdo dhamara kara kukune diki kiyo mato shingdo jiran jiktab shabiki shingdo dhamara liyasi yo marwa koron apple kukune apple ki kiyaga saban tab kukore cholma kukune cholma kwaya samata di nashi tuendo kara kukune gyu chile tene yunguru mato gyu mea bachine dhrutuya yo marwa gyu jiran jiklaya chasan dhrutuya yo marwa chesa dine inza 나도 동화도 매봐 수행에 삼로 요시 아는 거 배시 다도 동화 요의 규定주기 배시 단 거래. 이제 동화 요의 규리 배시 단 거래. 동화 요의 규리 배시 단가자 안디 제보디 규리 배시 단의 규리 쌓아도 제보디 동화 연구 거래 생각 소리야.
Despite longing to be rid of suffering, we keep running directly towards suffering itself. And this is because the reason we keep running directly towards the unwanted goal, the unwanted result, is because we haven't correctly yet identified the causes that lead to suffering. Both happiness and suffering come about independent on causes. We don't just encounter them. They are results that have come about independent on causes. And because our method for eliminating suffering is flawed, we do not eliminate the actual causes that lead to suffering, and in fact, we keep planting seeds that lead to further suffering. So just like a gardener or a farmer knows that if they want a particular plant or crop to grow, that specific seed needs to be planted and nurtured in the correct manner. This is widely known and accepted, and not just in agriculture, but in general in our life. But the specific seed needs to be known and then how to care for it. And that knowledge is what we lack. And therefore, our method is flawed. Therefore, when we employ our methods and techniques to overcome suffering, it doesn't happen. We keep rather planting seeds that will lead to further suffering. And this is why we experience unwanted situations again and again and again.
Dini inza da nga zuge dunga duri semyo kyansi da nga dunga duri yagi da nga zuge mi ina da jige semje dundro ina ja kari imene chasa nga zuge da nga zuge mi rushi chawe na ane kari chigorasi na nga zuge jige zambli nala ya kashi ge lega lega ore kashi ge kuma ge gore kashi ge sirimba chigore kashi ge maa ge gore da kashi ge jige terga tuya da dini ge jikshi u chigore 디 차상 가르치는 지고로서는 차상 안에 소수기 동아디 파 돌아야다 소수를 디기 주야게 된다라 지고로와 차상 된다 두스 삼다베네
People throughout the world, the primary activity that it consumes most of their physical time and energy as well as their mental energy is their form of employment, their primary activity. So whether someone is in any field of work or chooses to go into being a community leader, such as a politician, or chooses to go into a form of employment that potentially brings them into great physical conflict, such as in the military, or someone who chooses a path that is or an form of activity that is largely derided by the community, such as being a criminal. Whatever form of activity people engage in, they do so with the same motivation. They want to be happy. They want to be happy through overcoming problems. This is the motivation behind everything.
안디나시 먼저 점리나리아 출루 몽보요래 저 최시간 세야되게 찾아 가르치고서는 저 최시간 냐면 공격이어서 찾아 누하도야다 디기 두야 된다 지거로 저선 되니자 먼저 구마고 그이나라 지나 내가 지다다 시련바시나다 다지게 고호단 마수 잡되겠네 되니지나다 최베이나다 가르치님 가르치기나 차산 자위기 미유디 소수기 동화세야다 소설이야 디기 주에게 자위 미유디 디차되어 와다 뮤직 바로 차대 이나 다 디기 주에게 동화세야기다 아니 디기 주에게 탑람이야 다 가시게 탑람도 총자고라 가시게 레가레고라 가시게 아니 구마자고라 가시게 마자고라 아니 가시게다 뒤지게 곰자다 최냠네 곰자다 최로 저지고라 차사디 고 디기 주에도 동화세계 탑람 배시 나이데 가가가 차되마다 자위 미유디 지바 차되어 여러와
In our world, now and in the past, there have been a wide variety of religions and philosophies. And within these religions and philosophies, a wide variety of techniques are presented. And these are all directed towards the achievement of happiness and the overcoming of problems and difficulties. Goal is the same. And this is because it's an overriding motivation of all beings. And whether people in society, they choose activities that are outside the realms of the law, or they choose to engage in legal activity but perhaps come quite close to illegal activity, or those who have regular jobs, whatever it may be, or those who express themselves in violent manners or aggressive manners, or those who engage in very the contrary form of activity, who try to create harmony between individuals or communities. Whatever it may be, whilst there is this great variety in expression, the motivation and the objective is the same: happiness and freedom of pain and misery.
대사당은 저기 구마장을 지금 배나 구마장을 찾아배나 꼭 대지 동화도에 세미가 동화니를 오버 죽세 significant 다 배가서 구마장을 삼다배나 구마장디 가르스모스는 그런 게다 동화되나 저기 벤 튕긴디 이라배나 동화데 강아데 세기리 세베게 지상 강아 세게 된다 디 강아 세배는 하나 디기디 연구해서 디기 주에 된다라 그 탑람 가르 비슷한 바래서는 소수의 강아세야다 소수의 디기 주야라 현지 잘라고야다 현지 초점 제야디 이거 탑람 비슷한 제로와 세상 미자유 그런 공론 가르서는 그런 게 동화돼야다 그런 디기 되게 셈군에 디라 셈군에 디라와제 다 동화니랑 엄버 육세도 디기 주야다 강아세이 탑람 들라 가르 비슷한 거서 현지 잘라고 마자로와 구마자요 나 구마자요도 안다지 제보 가르리그레세나 디 제보데 동화 용거레베 디기 용거레 동화 매어서 두고 말아서 매어서 두고 오면 nem발리고라 가르세나 고구마제도 니 고군다 년도 베기 고 주야다 안델리아 녀셰다야 정가나루야 안데 오스트레일리아 중디와 있는다 베미 제가비야 보인다 안지미 볼스키 주변에 정가 녀셰다야마도 년동다야다 되네 가면도와 다 야합 산다 가시는다 고 돈다유마 당보 코로는 주요되네 꼴에 계시디야마 쪼바 하시셔 쪼바니도 야 다시 당한테 신이 계시디야다 안은 정가나로 녀다다야다 강아 망모지고 제가 대지쿠에 삼로 나라 갈레스네 디기 주변에 동화 세계에 삼로 지체 니 돈다게 탑람디 디 주변에 탑람들라 구마고 제가 탐마 구마고요도 디기 제보들라 동화야에게 잡라 아세 디기 용야에게 잡라 동화되어야다 아니지 디기 주위에 살아 강할래 되어 잘 제가 동화들이 있으면 동화를 뭔가 죽세야 돼가지고 구마다고 지를 빼샤바나 되네.
To take first an illustration that's easy to understand in relation to these first two lines, though beings long to be rid of suffering, they run directly towards the suffering itself. If we think of someone who intentionally engages in activity they know that is illegal, for example, they're stealing, What is their motivation? It's the same motivation as we all have. They want to be happy and freed of difficulties. What is their goal? They want to achieve, fulfill that motivation, and live happily, freed of problems. Their method, though, is to engage in illegal activity. So this we can, as law-abiding people, we can readily recognize as a faulty method. We wouldn't necessarily criticize their wish to be happy and this objective they want to achieve, but we certainly would point to their technique, their method, as being faulty. Because eventually they will get arrested and they will be prosecuted, excluded from society, and imprisoned. In societies other than Australia, many societies, they will also be physically abused, perhaps even tortured, and perhaps even executed. So whilst that thankfully does not happen here, they are still punished and excluded from society. So here we can readily see that despite having the same goal as everyone else, their method is clearly faulty.
dire nan chungharu dan 저기 딜에 대치가 채와치 삼다베나 dan 저기 개합지기 찌리야 안에 마자야디 가진 자고라서는 아주 개합 미마디게 디기고도 안솔이야 콘주기 디신 안솔라 강아 지고 지상요 콘주 매봐 서봐나 강아의 세계 됐어야지 데니 전에 가지고 진에 군로디 안지기 아딘 콘주 매봐 콘주기 강아지 콘주 매봐 서샤바네 만주 디기 두두고래 안솔라 강아디 매봐 차그래 삼제 누시네 내 마음하고 자요 마자고로 저 군로디 가서는 소수기 개합다 소수기 안지 미리다 디기 주야다 안지기 동화세에 소수 동화세에 된다래야 안지기 데니게 돈에 소수기 담년다요도 아 담년다셔도 소소레 디기와로 담년다 여바나 지미 bombo도 빼면 야고 쉬어도 지세진 소소 디기와 데니게 디기를 차네 안데 데려야 디주에게 된다라다 라렌 카르타고스네 비슈 카르타고스네 젠리아 마자에 베시단 거로 진짜 마자에 베시 땅에도 갑라 안디기 안지게 델야 안디기 주에게 잡라 아니 강아 몽부 파쳐들야 강아 안 소수기 마게도 소수미마 마자가 따도 안 소수미 마메디게 몽부시다 강아 몽부티가 컨트롤 마메디게 다 bom보랑 코로나데 지금 마자 조고마데 마메디게 조고 소수기 미리게 마메디게 조도 소수기 밀리아 컨트롤야 강아 자도야데 디니게 소 천자와 소조에게 강아 몽부티고 디네자 디시에 안 디멘비게다 디네진에 점레레 녀라 차차도네 강아 디치자 동화세에 잡리야 동화 마야야 아니 게디나 마리야 보토마도네 데니 bom볼이야 셈제슈 오던가 쇼서 다양한 민지리게 제상 bom보디 쥐마서 섬징알이야 시시에 뭐 땅그레 삼제 아야 bom보디야 셈제 뭐 리기로 하다 제상 데니게 돈에 아니 강아 안지게 데니 디 아니 지게 다마데게 천차게 릭 주변도 갈래 델리아 조선망보다 위망보 조선 땅거야 아니 미망게 돈에 체 돈에 강아제야 아니 네시 자산 디니제도 갑라 아니 디기 주변에 잡라 아니 동아디 차데 거로와
Taking another illustration that's easy to understand, and that's conflict between nations, especially when it escalates into warfare. This too, like every activity, comes from the motivation, I want happiness. And here, the leaders of the country that initiates the conflict, they will have that wish for themselves and their group, their community. They will want happiness for themselves and their nation. And they will believe that this neighboring country is obstructing their attainment of happiness. And based on this wish for happiness, they will engage in a particular method. In this case, one of using force in order to achieve happiness. And often, because of the way this is communicated, the leaders who are making this decision will be encouraged and perhaps praised and certainly supported by their population. Seeing this, who will also see this as a technique that will bring happiness, fulfill their own wishes for happiness. And when warfare comes, we know the politicians, the decision makers, they stay in their offices. they are not the ones whose life are in danger, whose bodies are being harmed, and their lives are perhaps being ended. Those involved in the conflict, the soldiers, they are in grave danger. They are experiencing tremendous mental as well as physical anguish and pain, as well as the invaded civilian population too. But not only is the suffering experienced by those directly in conflict, those who initiated the conflict, they will have suffering in that they will have mental anguish. What if this isn't going as well as I hoped? What if it's not going if the outcome's not quite as I hoped for? So they will be suffering through mental anguish. And then certainly, in terms of the nation, if we look at it a little bit more broadly, where there is an outset or an outlook of needing to arm and militarize our society, all that money and investment and mental energy and development that goes into armed forces presents huge wasted opportunity for development that would be for the good of the nation in its entirety. Investments in other forms of the nation have to be forsaken because a powerful military is wanted. So in this way, we see again a motivation for happiness with an objective to achieve a state freed of problems that is though executed through a method which we know is faulty, that cannot lead to a state of lasting happiness.
망고 쉬우신데 돼요 말와 근데 semjenji 코로나를 지 투제 징제 저는 코로나 제 되스마다 직니스마다 네트워크가 말와 다 당한 밀리나 냐마 미 삼로 야게 야게 마도 갑라야 미디게 안 소소라나 지 투보라잖아 미카시 좀제 락진나 다데네게 족과를 쉬이되는 신 마도 셴메르와 된마 미 남주 삼다디 야야야신나 리브 베제 야야야 땅지는 나 대사 삼다베네 직나 주기 베직 지게 나 주기 가서 천자릭 충주지게 냄샤디 베네 롬보 망보 도시 다제 미 망보 쇠투야 강보 망보 쇼 도르투야게 디니기 쇠체네 비셔다네 직강아 쇠투고로와 디차상 가르쳐 버시는 아주 군로 삼로디 라려 버려. 가서는 아주기 삼로디 야가지기 삼다바데 판도 주투고 누가지 삼다나 빼 강아치 못 주투고 아주 삼로디 베지다 디네 투고 얼와다 삼남지 르고 베지 르고 쉬우 베지다 투고 얼와. 제네 현장 아주 군로디 지 디니기 쇠도 갑라 가르쳐 버서네 디니스 쇠바이나 강바 디니스 tortubre 디니스 쇠바니 미 디니스 투브레 삼베게 다 디토리아다 쇠게 된다려 군롱기 삼로디 디니지 삼로 케지 군롱아 디니 베지 다제네 디니 디토네 안직 베제 다제네 베직 천자 신나 처부슈 디게 쇠제네 안직 마자다 디니기 미지 호로네 직 미동자모 쇠투야기 디니스 거와 지소 삼로 베지 남주의 베지 단 셈제 dunjole 디니지 쇠투가 메와 요 semchelji semjenji 천자 쇠샤 세지에서 호랑스 되서 징님마다 현재 돼야 말어 아주 밀리야 남주 비지 다제 두신의 쇠고로 봐 제가 디네에서 강아 먹고 쇼제야디 제투에 줘야디 미 남주 비지 다제 남주디 야사지래 베지만 현래 채워지비기 제세기 초를 비지 다요도 디네기 토네 아니 강아 먹고 제투야디 채고로 봐
As I mentioned in our previous talk, whilst all beings long for happiness freed of pain and misery, there's a tremendous difference between humans and animals in terms of our intelligence. When animals are in a state of danger, they have very limited options. They can fight, they can run, they can hide. There's very little they can do. Humans, though, have not only those options, But independent on our tremendous intelligence, we have far more choices before us. So since beginning this time, humans have formed communities to defend themselves, perhaps created alliances between communities, and also used their intelligence to develop weaponry. And in our modern day, we're independent on the intelligence of generations that have gone before us. Weaponry now is of great, great power. That weapons that are relatively quite small can cause huge destruction. And this has all come about in dependence on the use of human intelligence. And human intelligence is an incredible, perhaps you can say, tool, but it can be used generally in one of two ways. A way that brings great benefit or brings harm. But whichever way it is utilized, the motivation and the objective is the same. Wanting happiness, wanting to achieve through creating whatever it may be, to achieve a state freed of problems and difficulties. But when that intelligence, that method in between, is used in a harmful way, then weaponry of great destructive power is created. One can imagine the scientists and engineers who are involved in the development of weaponry, looking at how they can bring various chemical compounds together to create something of great destructive power that can destroy what communities have built over generations, that can take thousands of lives. And when they're trying to encourage those within the government who make the purchases to buy particular weaponry, they'll talk about the kill factor and how many people can be killed for this a number of dollars being spent. So we see here the role that intelligence plays. Nevertheless, though, we recognize that the motivation is to achieve a state of happiness. Yet, the human intelligence is being used to kill and destroy.
namdru pasu pun jushu cheya anjige lo ki to dene soya da shenle disu sudu kale namdru de nga de mi pasu de namdru soya da lo soya da dene ki soya de ke chasa nga jugi milya 펜비게 삼라 삼다지 어디네 전에 판선 조디보다 약용서라 강아 세사선 비 펜베 선비 군이나 군노 디니 토네 지 수용도 갑라 아니 제제 남주서야래 아니 지게 컴퓨터도 취재자라 서야래 안 하바도 네바디가 네네슬 디니기 네디 세야리아 직면주 디니시우스 펜베 삼 선비 군이나 지 면디게 수용도 갑라 내가 아주 차살이야 아니 샤리아 강아 세야다 아니 디키투야 연구가 받은 아주기 통치수 교바 세보자 디군로데 가서 펜베시비 군이나 대시 취재 천재를 써야지 네베 선비 군이나 알아 강부가서 떠오고도 미간에 쓰고도 데니신데 데니스 좀야게 또야게 단달이야 군로 데니신에 써봐자 니기 제부 동하용 거래 당아 지금 펜베스 군로들 삼로데 리버 삼로데 펜베스 삼로 야고 다 니기 남주 비시 다제 안제 샤리아 도시네 주연데 깔라 남주 써야래 안지 모자 써야래 데네가 지금 로서야래 취재자라서 디스 비시 다는 한솔 미망게 강아 먹보셔야 돼 디기주대 책으로 디군로디 펜베스 육군에나 써봐라 지상 펜베스 육군에나 써봐있나 니 제부들라 라신이가래 디기숑고래 동아셔야 돼 강아셔야 돼 디기주도 보래 군론들이야 네베선비 군내라지 söbe나 디기주비에게 탑람 디sö베네 디네 라신이가라 강아요 아마 동아요 아마도 디기요야 돼 매바로
Behind all activities is the wish for happiness. But how this is expressed is through a motivating mind, and this can be either on the side of being wholesome or unwholesome. Wholesome motivation is wanting to help and be of benefit to oneself, to one's group, to all. And the unwholesome side is not thinking broadly enough, either directly wanting to achieve happiness through harming others or being indifferent to the harm that may come. And in our world, we can see both sides clearly expressed. So, for example, with a wish to achieve happiness and a wholesome motivation, there's so much good that's being done in society. Most obviously, we can think of medical developments over centuries, and especially in our modern times, we can see this so clearly that science is producing wonderful medical results, improving the quality of people's lives. And this isn't just happening. This is being done by people who want happiness and are using their human intelligence in a wholesome way, a beneficial way. And especially when the motivation goes beyond just themselves and just beyond themselves and their group towards society in general, societies in general, then really tremendous good can come. And such a motivation is not only expressed in the obvious fields such as medicine or education, but really throughout science, engineering, technology, throughout all fields. People are expressing this wholesome motivation to be of benefit and are helping to improve their lives, the lives of their group, as well as society in general. But within each of those fields, there are also those who, despite holding the identical innate wish for happiness, they're using their intelligence in an unwholesome manner, either to intentionally bring harm or being unconcerned about the harm that may or will follow. So here we can recognize that within society there are so many who are using their intelligence in a creative way to bring good, but there are also those who are using their intelligence in an unwholesome manner that will directly and or indirectly bring harm.
That in this 되게 땡이 전수로 경험을 전수로 시행을 마도 디니스디 경험적이 내래 야후와 되는 취시하다 직대내게 도와주지 않는 가다가 연구에 점을 나내서 간다 연구해 봐대 경험적 빼야고 하고 그걸 땡이디 경험을 야디 전수로 시행을 마도.
I think perhaps from what I've said, all that I'm saying that perhaps is new to some of you, is that the motivation is to achieve happiness, and this is the same for everyone. But in terms of the expression, the wholesome and unwholesome expressions within society, you individually can come up with far more examples than I can. You know what's the situation in the world much better than I do, in particular in terms of technology and engineering and science. You have far, far more knowledge than I do. So reflect on this and see these illustrations of people using their intelligence in wholesome, beneficial ways throughout society, and those who are using their human intelligence in ways that do bring harm.
이베텔에 대화 되자 디무베 랑기 대화 자들 좀 세지 지난 대화 되자 디무베 랑기 대화 자들 좀 세지 대신아 주기 대화 되지 동화세계 된다로 구마자다 마마로 전에 차와세 군롱의 세외 산백이 지금 군의 라제 디기주야다 아니 장게 동화세야다 디기주야게 된다라 세외 산백 군의 라제다 야가 제디게 차상 디기 랑기 대화 두고 어디 이나 랑기 대화데 매바수고레스 대화 되게 디무베스도 디무벨라도 디무발람나 데니게 세외 선비 군에 라제 라와 자와 체베나 디 제부도 동어 연구여바다 하모고레스 진짜 하고고 말레스 진짜 대화 영야다 동화세기 유가는질레 데는 두고여바다 데네 동화세 유가르실 띵고바다 하모고와제 디무베스 하모고와 디무바 디 하모고와 겐제데 데네 마로게다 군어 셴너바 체외 선비 군에 라지 레가체디기 dini cheya do kabla an dewa yong sabla dunga le yong cheza rangi dewa di padana ji meba su gores ma japche susugi jinda jawadi ma ji meba su ba na ji deji ge susugi dewa duye ge tablam beje ta adigi di beje ta di beje dige jebu dige nan rangi dewa di meba su yong ma dewa li go ma dewa meba su gore jere da chiki tanade.
Looking at the third and fourth line, though longing for happiness, in their confused ignorance, they destroy their own happiness as if it were an enemy. This term, confused ignorance, this is applied to those who, despite, like all of us, longing for happiness, engage in a method which they believe will bring happiness, but it does not. In fact, not only does it destroy happiness, it adds to the collection of causes that will lead to suffering. So mentioned the illustrations of those who involved in warfare, or the development of weaponry, or the decisions to engage in warfare. This is very obvious. They're motivated for happiness, but happiness is not the result. They're motivated to gain freedom from suffering, but suffering itself is the result. And this comes about not because of the fault in their desired outcome, they want happiness, but a fault in their method. And this is where they are confused. They're confused in terms of their skillful method.
Zadan timuk ba se timuk se de la da jig mangbali gre kan che timuk la de ni ngwe ni su de machine ba se gore ben gyu de ne che ben de bu din ji yo ba ya ham de bu kan de jung go ba da ha mo go wa de le timuk sa ha mo go wa je ne timuk se ro an di na shin da de timuk se de la ya rig chi ya da sem nga ju ge chue rang xin ge sem ge rang xin wo kan jing na wa na ji chue kan nang ge ben ne nga so na wa na xin da ga la sim je 그 뭐 간스 나와나시 여담에 뭐니 수디 지다이 지다와지다 하 먹어야 디목세 디목 된세요. 제가 디목세를 단다 디목세들 디 페이기 니 수디 심마지 하 먹어야 되라 디목라고 그래. 하 먹어야 레 제부 뒤제반에 제부 된지 연구여 봐디 하 먹어야 니 수지 공부와 하는 아주 되네게 디나시다 랑게 최 탐지게 랑신 랑게 셈나랑 나세야디 랑신 간지 여봐 디 하 먹어야 디목세 되네 거 되네게 디게 한 먹어 왜 끼인기 마술이야 아니 디기 줍타데 신고 말레스 디기 줍에 마신 와제 디기 줍에게 유디 강아요야 유디 배시 다셔 거레스 니수 신바이나 아니 배시 당 말레스 데자 디네서 마신 와인자 동아요야기 매바서에게 다 디기 줍에게 유디리야 강아요야 유디마 배시 당 거레스 니수디 하고 바이나 디 배시 당 말로 와서 그렇다.
This term, confused ignorance, has many layers to it, levels of subtlety. A coarser, more obvious level is an ignorance or a confusion about what causes lead to a particular result. So where one is confused about cause and effect, one will perhaps desire a particular effect, but accumulate the wrong causes. And this is because of an ignorance about where that lacks correct knowledge and an integration of that correct knowledge. A subtler, or a far subtler level of ignorance is to do with the nature of reality, where one is ignorant about the nature of reality. For example, the nature of the mind, the nature of the person, how phenomena actually exist in reality. And an important point to say on this that we can understand more readily is that generally in our life, if we are ignorant of a particular situation, we are likely to make a wrong decision because we don't actually understand, we don't have all the information, we don't really understand what's going on, so we'll make a wrong decision. And therefore, and this we know from our own life, and it's like this on a very coarse day-to-day level. And it's certainly the case when one doesn't understand reality that one will make wrong decisions and that will lead to further suffering.
제자당 저기 니수디 싱바 수요인데 마싱바데 매바 차로 걸어 근데 지금 규되는 제번에 제부 되는 용그래 제부 야가디 용그로 누가 용그래 디 용그래서 니수다 하고 봐네 싱바이네 셰바이나 되네 니수 마시바데 매바 차로 걸어 매바 차도 되네 디 토네 시 니수디 하고네 내가 레바이나 디 제부들이야 소수기 누가 미디어 반자 소수 누가 영향을 규디 베지단 거 말와 소수기 대기 되고 봐자 소수기 대기 매바 소액이 아주 규디 베지단 거 말와 소수 대기 영향이 규디 베지단 거 봐. 제가 되네서 저왕한테 셈이야 군론이야 셈기 토네 아니 아주 규 되는시 제바나 제부 강아 되는시 용그래 삼로 되는시 따바 내가 레바이나 강아 되는시 투그래 대기 삼로 되는시 따지 내가 레바이나 제부 가서 대기 되는 투그래 셈비게 하고와죠. 하고와디 싱바디 디무부기 독쇼 디무서데 마싱바지. 니서 하고와디 디무기 독쇼리. 제가 디네서 니서 하고와 제냥 아주게 안지 게슈스 무두고 레가디 저거디 자네 디기 두두고리에서 제가 하고다 먹어서 조원서 셈미다네 주라리 거래. 제가 디네자 아주게 셈미 돈의 교와 단제 안도시네 조원아도 디기 두비하다 동아세에게 탑람디 세미톤에 죽고 해야 돼. 근데 예체와를 자고와.
Confused ignorance. This clearly is a mind. Consciousness is not matter. It is consciousness. So the state of unknowing is a mind. And what overcomes this mind of not knowing is the contrary mind of knowing. So it's knowledge that overcomes ignorance of a situation. So this too we know from our daily life. And in particular, in the context that we're looking at here, not only do we need to gain knowledge so as to overcome ignorance, but that knowledge needs to be integrated. It needs to become ingrained deep within us. And here we can look at this in differing levels. One, the coarser level, would be to come to understand what should be adopted, in other words, which ways of thinking consciousnesses should be developed because they will lead to the desired outcome, and what ways of thinking should be abandoned because unless they are abandoned, we will keep encountering unwanted situations. So therefore, we need to gather knowledge to overcome ignorance, and we need to integrate it within ourselves so that we act under it. It influences us in our daily life, in our decision making.
어디네 자당 저기 남부 산지 비기 당아 저기 디기주에다 동화세들이야 조 셈기 때문에 셈교를 다야다 셈교하다 셈 나라 아니 삼로 나라 로 아니 균규 초릭지다 야가 초릭니 체제 균이 직디기 매봐서야 아니 야가 릭 삼로디 검시신 야 뉴바 체르다야기 어두신의 롭종 남바산지 비기 취기 토데 람데 디는 거 조디는 거 제자당 셈 나라 되샤 콩로아 나야세디 디수기 라신니가를 뇌게제스 제자 디 삼로디 야고요 말해서지 제자 군롱 현래 뇌베 삼바 세외 삼바 군에 나지 레 군에 나바이나 디기 레가 가라야 제베나 라신니가를 뇌게지 레용고래세 다 군롱들야 현래 펜바데 제와데 젬베스 제외 삼바시 군롱시 레베나 디게 라신니가를 펜바시 용고래세 제자 디 인자다 조옹아도 레가 가르친 당부 군롱들야 제 예침보체네 남바산이비 취기도네 롭종 셈감직비게 지게 랍체제가도 갑라 당부 군론들이야 잠지게 삼는데 고구리 해서지 두순 거봐.
It's important that you understand the term practice or training. So practice in Buddhism is focused on the mind. It may be expressed physically and verbally, or it may be expressed solely mentally. However it is expressed, practice means is focused on the mind. And this is because Buddha Shakyamuni taught that whatever one engages in, the outcome is dependent on the motivation. The motivation is mental. So therefore, we need to train through our practice, train our mind, So whether one is engaging in a physical activity, a verbal activity, or solely thinking, focus is on the mental part. The physical and verbal is an expression of that. Because if we allow spontaneously afflictions, unwholesome minds such as anger, attachment, pride, or jealousy to arise, harm alone will follow. Whereas if we, through training our mind, through practicing, we develop an habituation to wholesome minds such as love, compassion, ethics, generosity, patience, only benefit comes to ourselves and others. So therefore, the meaning of Buddhist practice is mental development, practicing thinking in wholesome ways, practicing to weaken unwholesome ways of thinking. This is the meaning of practice or training. And it comes down to ensuring that our motivation behind everything is wholesome. Whether we express this again, physically or verbally, or it's purely or solely a mental activity, to ensure it is wholesome.
Disu chasan garachi ligo resena, tanga dimu se dimu nane tarduba, nga se nga rang ganglai madyoba, jiki gyudan kin ganglai ma koro ngani drupdyoba shi nga zo nango res, di nangwana dagala yore sambe samlo de nga zugile samlo zu yores, di dimuk tenzin se res, chizanda di nyomoba chasan yoyega zawa di res, ko meba sosheba ina, di meba soba ina, ane duyasha kondro nga je yungu mare, di meba ina kunlong ngamba set ligi mare, shenla tsewe samba ligi mare, di maleba ina rashi nigala an dunga yoya di yung mare, chizan denigi nesu di dimu di meba soba ina, meba soya ne nga zuki jawa kar drubi ne, da digo suso digi druptu ya tang dunga setuwe jungri, chizan nga zu dunga yoya yuzo di nga zuki dimu tenzin seya di res, di dimu tenzin se dimu se kande seya nga se nga zu na nga seya di gangla ya ma dewa rangu ngueni druptu kin, rangu ngueni drupa zimba tela dimu tenzin la go re chire.
With some knowledge and reflection, one can recognize that the afflicted minds, the destructive emotions such as anger, attachment, pride, and jealousy, these are what cause us pain and suffering. These are our true enemies. And it's these that have to be abandoned. But what needs to be also recognized is that these are results that come from a cause. The root cause of every affliction is an ignorance of self-grasping. So this is the subtlest form of confused ignorance, is the ignorance of how phenomena exist in reality. This ignorance, this consciousness that is an ignorance, believes that phenomena, for example, the self, the person, exists in the way that it appears. We believe that every object of thought, someone else, a material phenomenon, or our self, exists precisely how it appears. We take it to be true, what appears to us. And ignorance grasps at this, believing that things really are the way they appear, without any doubt that at a fundamental level, whatever it is we're thinking about, or the person, exists in the way that it appears to us. But this is actually not in accordance with reality, hence it's an ignorance. And it's an ignorance, in particular this ignorance that grasps at the self. This is the one that from which all our afflictions arise. So the method, the technique to eradicate, eliminate this ignorance is the ultimate or the supreme method to abandon suffering and thereby attain a state of lasting happiness.
That Donalma Sanyu Jumnediki Karasumvaresene, Dongba Shiwa Kewa Mibesul, Mishebin Droa Chamgurbe, Teta Tujuengabe Tabzuji, Riba Kadakin, Super Zes, Ondo Sonyer.
And we come to the final verse, which is from a sutra called Dialogue with Rashtrapala. The way of existing is empty, peaceful, and unproduced. Not knowing that causes migrators to wander. Through the compassion arisen for them and the skillful means of hundreds of logical reasons, the Buddhas set them upon a path.
nga se na da phumbo sin chasang kan sin shen le tuen ne zhuba ma do shen le ma tuen ne zhuba me ba le ji me ba za shen tuen ne zhuba na shen le ma de ba gang la ma de ba rang ne zhuba di dong ba le se dong ba za ne ji rang ne ma zhu bi ge rang gang la ma rang ne zhuba ge xi wa le se xi wa se yo ma le se wo le ji san jie wa me ba se de xi wa se de rang ne zhuba de yo ma le xi wa se lo rang ne zhuba ge yo ma le se 시와 세대 강바주에는 매바 차선 식송서로 시와서로 시와세 식말면 시와라나 셈게 라신 코롱 랑응원이 주비게 주바데 말해서 그러와 제가 랑응원이 마주바자 그 시와래서 그러와 셈 코롱 라신 아 최간의 라신디 안에 강라면 랑응원이 주바데 말해서 제가 랑응원이 주바데 시와래서 시와라는 매바 양주 녀모바 차상 녀모벌 시와라도 녀모 빵바들 시와라 그러와 진짜 녀아주의 셈게 셈다 안가 풍부 간듯이 최 간듯이네 강라에 마도 랑원의 주바 마주바 대지 랑원의 주바 되게 동바래라와 다 랑원의 주바 동바엔상 랑신기 랑원의 자원의 주 마녀와래 진짜 시와래스 다 깨와 매바스데 유지기 최라서 봐도 뭐버디기 깨와 요래데 이네 샹라 뛰는 규단 깬라 뛰는 기구를 마도 규단 깬 강라에 마도 랑원의 깨와디 매바래스 지산디네 수디 마신 바래스 마신 바인자 미셰베 아니 마신베 깬게 원게 아니 아 저게 되샤 콘로 녀모 제제 아니 가 도와 참교 봐서 코발이야 가브리엘의 밀리게 가브리엘 둔조레게 까지 두시는 코비 동안에 참체 동안 두스 연구를 해제
Looking at the first two lines, the way of existing is empty, peaceful, and unproduced. Not knowing that causes migrators to wander. So just looking at the first line and part of the second, the way of existing is empty, peaceful, and unproduced. Not knowing that. So right now, ourselves and all ordinary beings, we do not know that the way phenomena exist is that they are empty. What empty means is they are empty of existing in the way that they appear. So phenomena such as the self, or every phenomenon, everything we think of, every object of thought, appears to us as if it exists by way of its own nature. And therefore we believe it exists exactly as it appears. The way that it appears is true. That is how it exists, by way of its own nature, its own self-existence. But it's actually, when one meditates and comes to realize the way it exists is empty of existing by way of its own nature or essence or characteristics. And when one realizes that all phenomena, every phenomenon without exception, is empty, one abides in a state of peace. Particularly when one realizes that the mind, both the coarser levels, but also the subtlest of levels, that too is empty of existing in the way that it appears, empty of existing by way of its own nature, one abides in a state of peace. And that state of peace, as well as how phenomena appear, this all comes about in dependence on causes. All phenomena, everything that exists in dependence on causes, and therefore it is produced. But there is a view that phenomena are unproduced. in that one doesn't recognize the causes, doesn't recognize that a particular situation has come about in dependence on causes, and therefore it will pass. And if differing causes are accumulated, a different result, perhaps a wanted result, will come about. Rather, one often instinctively relates to things as if not only do they exist in the way they appear, but one doesn't recognize all this is a result of the accumulation of causes. Those causes too, just like the result, are also empty. When one realizes that, one abides in a state of peace. So this is all unknown to us and ordinary beings at the moment. Whereas in reality, ourselves, every other living being, everyone in this room, all humans, all non-humans, are empty. All phenomena, despite material phenomena, despite appearing to us as existing by way of their own nature, are empty. Every consciousness, if we think about a particular consciousness that appears to us as existing by way of its own nature, it too is empty.
Denige na dar majuba de lo tongba yisi gores jizan di ha ko gores jizan di ha ko ya dundala deta tuje ngabe tabsugi riba jada kuni jubar se sedu deni semje deta tuje ngabe denege semje tamje digi de tubya da dunga de jadu ge semje zewa ze wangi ane denige nga se rashing tuba tongba ni toyege dundala toye de tablam riba mangu je songje sanji du che songje ne denige ha ko ya ya 동의 도발지고래 세지 주발지에서
Just first, as the translator, to add something I omitted in the previous segment with unproduced, that phenomena, the further meaning to this is all phenomena which are empty of inherent existence have always been empty of inherent existence. Then to continue with this segment now. So the second line concludes, not knowing that causes my greatest to wonder. In other words, not knowing that the way of existing is empty, peaceful, and unproduced, beings continue to accumulate causes that keep them bound in cyclic existence. And then the verse continues, through the compassion arisen for them and the skillful means of hundreds of logical reasons, the Buddhas set them upon a path. The Buddhas who have realized perfectly how all phenomena abide in reality, through their unsurpassable compassion, they teach that to receptive sentient beings. They teach beings through the usage of many illustrations and reasonings. They teach beings how to meditate on reality. And the way to meditate is through gathering vast knowledge and integrating this through meditation. This meditation involves logical reasonings to come to recognize how all phenomena, despite appearing to be self-existent or existing by way of their own nature or essence, is empty of existing in this way. And all phenomena have always been empty of existing in this way, so unproduced, and lead beings to develop a path of peace, which is when one realizes the nature of reality, one's mind is undisturbed by the afflictions that arise from ignorance, and thereby one abides in peace. So to come to recognize how phenomena abide in reality, the Buddha taught many methods. Amongst these, the supreme method is that of dependent arising. And when one, and then how to meditate on dependence arising? Well, it first takes an object to reflect on, and the object of the self or the person is seen as easier to recognize than the object of the mind.
The Pami Gebainaya and Dogo and Sierra Marana, near to my Shidurua, Yagi Yardrotuma, Denesia. On the ocean some, and then answer Paso Drodu Gabla, Naduguya, said the Gastus, and then answer Pumbola, Gangba, Lava, Denis, Dene to Yuba, Pumbola, Dene, Gangba, Dene to. I did ever say that Diosegi, Sagichil, Dene, you mother don't buy anything on De to Omara, Chesa, De to Mera, Chesa, Denis, Dene to Chesa. Kia dia xian ji le dui ne ji ge du ji zang han zu cui dia xian se le din de cui gu du an han zu ji bu yong de xian ge jiam zhe le din de yong gu du dan han zu ne pa zu zhuo ya dan jia wa ji wa dan han zu peng bo su bu peng bo de le dui ne zhuo gu du ji zang da di ji ge re da ma re za hao guo ya de nang sam lo le din de hao gu du ji zang ha se di xian ji ge ji mang bo ji dui de ba ma do 강라야 마되바 지지 가세데 네투야 코라 민도아 선비기 데네기 삼다베 나가지 담보 가세 땡진 제와죠 삼다데디 땡티게 라바라바 루시네 삼다베네 코 차차차 삼다 투고르바.
If we take then our body, thus we can readily recognize that it is dependent on others. For example, we are dependent on our parents. If we didn't have parents, we wouldn't have been conceived. And even if we had been conceived, we remain dependent on them in order to be born, and then we remain dependent again so that we could grow. We're dependent on the care and the kindness of our parents so that we are fed nutritious food, and we will continue to be cared as we grew up. And then moreover, as we aged, we continued to be dependent on a wide variety of people for their direct as well as indirect activities that ensured that we could live to our current age. So, for example, that we are all sitting here is dependent on people who have created our cushions, who created our flooring and the roof above us, and likewise in our homes, all our material possessions. These that we need have all been created by others. So therefore, our very existence from conception up to now is dependent on the kindness of so many people.
Ganesh Nangudu, two Chine Shimjuche. The Nepa na some time Kalanga, says some time, Anzo Lolianga, said Chardu Becala Crassos. Pumbo did that Shenlia, Junior, Jehovah met again. Corong money, Juba Yudivaji, Nangorda. Chesa did Nangtang did the Jing of the Jeva Chain, the Shenla Tun, the Chiba Chak Desine. That's a child Marwa cousin, that the Nandu Kabla, Gasan Kala, Maduba, Corong Chibu, Rang when you heard about Nangorba. Chesa the Jing of the Jeva Chidu Chidi, Pamala, Tempa, Sela, Tempa, and the Rangi Pumbola, Tempa, Semla, Tuba, Simado. Chesa didn't Maduba, not Mevare. Chesa Mevanza, Tangan, Nadu Kabla, Madu, Corong when you Juba, Yuba, Nang you do. Dinawanashi, Naji Yomar, that is Garson, Chasan Dinji George, Temba can show, Chizam, Kala Matin, but Nawanashi Yomar. Chizan Nawanashi Yomar, Mevas Nawana Yore Sembulodida, Timutis said. Chizan Dinawanashi, Zawin Yomare, somebody didn't Nawanashi did it, Zawin Mea, Sampe, some of down to Kabla, Deji Yore, Sampe, some of the Timutis in the Chun to war.
The first step of the meditation is to recognize how our self or our person, our I, appears to us. So this is the crucial first step, and it can at first be a bit difficult to recognize. But the way we believe we exist is as an independent, self-existent person that is separate from our physical mental aggregates, separate from our body and mind. But once we recognize we appear as if some kind of separate individual that is not that exists apart from our body and mind, we investigate to see if this is how we exist in reality. And we take the illustration given in the previous segment. Our body clearly is dependent. And in fact, it changes continuously. And when we look at this, we see that there is an interrelationship between our body, mind, and our sense of self. Our sense of self, our sense of our identity, is not something separate, unrelated. We are not some separate individual from our body and mind. But the consciousness that innately grasps at the self as being a separate, unique individual, separate as in not influenced by the body and mind, this is ignorance. This is the ignorance being referred to here.
Samlo taide cheba chede da ye chimbo chegore ine da de zo donda de nga ting sa bore sin da du tung chi liam mo chi che cha ga ma da donda nga zo kasin zu ka sa da ka zi ken yi da di ni men yi da zo ro je donda ning bo de ka sam ta ya sen nga zo sam na le ya ge di ne kun lo de dang bo khron le ya an chi da xian le ya pen be sam lo chi da xian le zai wa xian sim jian tam che di ki den ba sa da dunga da chao wu du di donda le ngi ane 판도 강도도 지기 샘비게 삼로치다 제화 치래 ane gedi 내다 나 류가 26권에 샬리아 뇌비 자와서 자와딘 지기 매 샘비게 삼로치 다 두신의 삼코라시 데네 삼다당 아주 군노들이야 대신 아주 나중에 디기 주비야다 동화세계 조 자위게 군노들 모탈 마선 당연 제보 나시디 가서 군노 차도 제정 군노들 샬라 최외 삼바다 뇌비 삼바지 군내라나 디기 류하게 넘겨래 샬레 자와데 뇌비 자와데 최외리가 디라진니가라 강아 제정 군노들 샬레 잠바다 제외 삼바게 바나 디기 토네 라신니가레 디기 주도에서 군노들 아주 디체 제정 샬라 군노 샬라 펜바다 잠제 삼다 류가 있으면 샬라 뇌비 지금에 선배 삼로디 어두신에 다야체 다데네 토네 당아 주게 되지 다데데 아주게 다데 셰바나시 아주 电线 저와 금세 삼다 제바 제제 beneda 공로 시켜봐 있나 개바 있는 디테일 간스카의 연구도 라라 뇌바 연구대 펜바시 연구도 제사다 차당 차과 개바는 라라 뇌바 연구 샬라 펜바 연구의 연구도 세배 있습니다. 다 잠제다 샬라 뇌베 잡아 지기 매스베 삼로 다도 신의 손에 샬라 펜베 삼는 내가 제바는 디테일 간의 연구도 이렇게 제바 제도 신의 삼다제 제사다 가 세야디 가서 대시바는 가 세야 소소에 나오게 갑라 간스 나로려 간스 난기도 나도 갈라에 마도 코롱 원에 주바 나도와 나와 나신지 뭐이니스도 두에 민두스 간데세세 뭐이니스는 마템바르데 뭐네 셴레 템바치도 두 제바치네 제사가 세당 보기데 아말레 띠네 겨와레 나 초와데다 세다 줄레 띠네 초와레 제사 데니시네 두 진신 파조 줘야 되나 류레 띠네 주고도 제사 데니시 류다 지셴지레 띠네 줍되고 마도 셴라 마데 바시 나세디 강라야 니에민도아 선비도 삼다디 나도 제바 제와디 다 두세 제바 제바이나 아 저기 디무 딘진세야디마 안에 매바서 두고 그래 디 매바서 바이나 아주 되샤 콘도 나게디게 리고 말 디마 제바이나 당아주 동아야야기 귀디 매바인자 안 동아용 말해 제래
We don't have the opportunity on this occasion to look at this meditation in the required or with the sufficient required detail. But the essence of what we've looked at in our talk here is the primacy of mind, the supreme importance of our mind. Hence, it is the focus of Buddhist practice. Everything that all beings do, physically do, verbally say, or the various thoughts that arise, come from a motivation of wanting happiness. Or to express it slightly differently, to overcome problems and suffering so as to experience happiness. This is the motivation of every thought that arises and its expression as physical or verbal activity. Because of the great importance then of thought, this is what we need to focus our energy on. Being aware, being mindful of our mental process, and using knowledge that you're gaining here and elsewhere, apply that knowledge to see, is a particular way of thinking harmful or beneficial? When annoyance or frustration or anger, for example, arises, is this beneficial for me and my expression of it? Is it beneficial to others? Is it beneficial in the short term and the long term? This we need to look at. That's one illustration, but across all the variety of minds that arise, we need to recognize what helps and what harms. And moreover, come to recognize that the sense it is from our belief that the self exists in a particular way, that all our desire, that we want things to go in a particular way, or we want to protect the self and therefore we push things away, all of those come from believing that we have this truly existent self. So we need to come to recognize that this is at the foundation, the center of all other thoughts, and then investigate to see if it exists in the way that it appears or not. And whilst our self appears to be a separate individual from our body and mind, we can recognize that it cannot be unrelated, despite appearing so. We can recognize that, for example, we all will identify, I am sitting right now. And that's independent on our body. So there's a relationship. Or, I came here earlier, I will walk away from here later, but we can only talk about ourself in that way, in relation to our body. So this is a very simple, coarse way to present it, and I mentioned a few illustrations about dependent on our parents, dependent on society. And these have great meaning if reflected on in a way far more deeply than I was able to present now. And if we can weaken this grasping at the self that appears to exist in a way that it actually does not at all in reality, all the afflictions that come from this, such as anger and attachment and pride and jealousy, they will weaken, and eventually we will eradicate them. And in this way, we will eradicate the actual causes that lead to suffering.
고방 투비 규칙에 사치 책을 드네자 경험주도 사이 빼면서 제수 일한学이 딱 경험주도 시작할 때 빼면서 제수 일한学지래 안 되는 인데나 경험주이네 안 되는게 딱 아주 되는지네 매년 3도 잠재 냠는 조금 자도 빼면서 야고 중소화선 비기 마음반에 기디네 소소라는 게 될이야 제수 일한 시 전수지야다 아니 안 마음반에 경험주게다 지기 디레 마초다 상인 파기디네 니메레리야 안지게 자신 안지 바바젠실이야 소와답제 소수다데 잠제 곰잡아데 야자 되네게 기디나지 니메레리야 도스체는 곰잡토바나 다 소소도 오체네 잠제 냠네도 제베네 되네 니미지다 니다 로다 다와다 된시 수수의 냠용을 도는 도시는데는 셈바디 야야 주고요바다 아니지 셈비 야 주비 긴기 아니지 라셴니가래 디기디 되서 주투고요바데 길리길리지나 수수의 냠용 되나 하고야 자기로와 되네자 안 되네게 야다 주시네 에리 되네자다 되네 도시네 빼야 보시면서 오셔 두지에 쉬어요.
In conclusion, I just want to say that it brings great joy to my mind to see all of you here who have gathered to meditate on love and compassion as expressed through Chenrezig. You've been doing it now for several days. and independent on your motivation that you have for being here and engaging in these sessions, and always with mindfulness, taking care of that motivation, you're creating the causes for enlightenment. You're certainly creating causes that will bring benefit not just to yourself, but to all those that you encounter. And this really brings great, great joy to me, and I rejoice in this. And it's my sincere hope that what you're learning here, you take it not just into your daily life, but into a daily meditation practice. Because the word meditation can be equally translated as habituation or familiarization, because that is the process or the purpose of meditating. One gathers knowledge and then familiarizes oneself or habituates oneself to that knowledge, to that way of thinking. And through familiarizing or habituating oneself to consciousnesses such as love and compassion, their opposing consciousnesses, selfishness, anger, and so forth, they proportionately weaken. And if you take what you've, the experience and the knowledge that you've gathered here into a daily meditation session, you will deepen that habituation. You'll experience ever more impact in your daily meditation and out of your meditation session. As you become more familiar with this way of thinking, becomes more integrated within oneself, one will readily be able to, through using mindfulness, recall what you meditated on that morning, and then ensure it influences one's interactions with others. And thereby, not only is your own mind more peaceful, loving, and calm, but your interactions with others will reflect that. And in this way, not only are you a happier, more self-fulfilled person, but those that you interact with, you will bring ever more love and calm and peace into their lives, enable them to deal with their own difficulties so much better. So in this way, you're becoming ever more beneficial members of society. And this really brings great joy to me. So I want to say thank you so much for gathering here, for coming together and putting your time and your energy into this practice.
And I
want to give a particular thank you to Tsepel, because I know how skillful she is at leading these retreats based on her many years of both knowledge and integration. So I want to give a particular thank you to her too. Thank you.